Monday.
Happy Monday, everybody.
Right. Happy Monday. Now, this is previously recorded because we had to work within our guest schedule today. So it is, this is not live, but if you're catching the show after the fact, just another day.
Exactly.
So yeah, normal day.
So we have an incredible guest on, and for those of you who have been with us since the very beginning as Fringe Majority TFM cast, then you will remember our guest from way back when. He was the very first guest that we ever had on the show, and he got us our first warning on YouTube, which was okay because we don't say things to please YouTube and the people who are on the other side of the agenda. We say things because they're right and they're true and they're factual. Mm-hmm. So he has been an incredible friend. He has done, oh my gosh, so many tours. He did a tour with myself and Dr. Trazi when we were doing the Do No Harm tour. And
a tour with myself with Justice for the Vaccinated. So I'm not sure when this man sits at home. Rarely ever. And another thing is that we probably won't touch on this during the conversation, but Dr. Hoffe is one of the first doctors. I think the second doctor in BC after Dr. Malthouse. He was the second doctor to write a scathing letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry, and had the presence of mind to do tests before and after the vaccines. So he had proof, and that caused a lot of issues, and an FOI came out on him, and that was when he was our first guest. I'm going to just stop talking because we're going to just bring on one of our favorite people on the planet now, Dr. Charles Hoffe. Charles, thank you for coming on the show.
Welcome.
Well, thank you for this kind invitation. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. Do you even remember doing our first show? Because that was the whirlwind of the FOI that came out. And
yeah, no, I mean, I think I now remember it. But this has been a whirlwind 4 years, and because the first persecution against me started. I mean, the instant that I pointed out safety signals with the vaccine, which was in March of 2021. It was literally in the third month of the vaccine rollout. Right. So this has been going almost exactly 4 years, and it's been a whirlwind. And thank you for reminding me about that. I'd forgotten about that.
Well, it wasn't supposed to happen. We were just doing that FOI, and we had proved in that FOI, we brought out some press conferences, and we proved that Dr. Henry got signals that AstraZeneca was causing heart issues. And she got that email at 11 o'clock in the morning. And then at 2 o'clock in the morning, she went on, or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, like 3 hours later, she went on air and said AstraZeneca was totally safe. And when that came out, I called you on a whim and just thought, if you're available, and you're like, I have this rare window. So you came on that like same day, like 2 hours later. And that was our very first guest. You were, and you did not get us kicked off YouTube, but just I'm sure
suspension notice.
You will at this point. Yeah. So, you can go and watch our old show. You can go over all that. There was the D-dimers, there was the FOIs, there was all that stuff. But 4 years later, you've been fighting a legal battle to keep your license and protect your reputation. And we just got some wonderful news yesterday.
Yes.
As we filmed this yesterday. So do you want to fill us in on your big win?
Yes. Well, just to fill in, your listeners and viewers. So I was accused by the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons of professional misconduct for pointing out the safety signals from the COVID vaccines. And I'd initially, as you mentioned, I'd sent a letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry to tell her what her shots were doing to my patients, and to point out to her that in my experience, at that point, the shots were more dangerous than COVID. Yeah. And of course, she didn't like that at all, and nor did the college. And so, because, I mean, that was the situation right back then in the third month of the vaccine rollout, which was about 15 or 16 months into the pandemic. And I was an emergency room doctor and a family doctor in a small town, and we had not had to treat one single person for COVID at that point. Not one. Not a single person had been brought into our emergency room that needed treatment. And it wasn't that people didn't get COVID. They got it, but it was minor. Yeah, that was minor. They just isolated themselves at home until they were better and carried on. And then once the vaccine rollout started, I had all of these horrendously desperate vaccine injured people coming into my office. And that's what I wrote to Bonnie Henry about, to say, there's something wrong here. The COVID is not as bad as you make it out to be. In fact, even at that very early point when COVID was at its worst, the mortality rate was about the same as the flu. And most of the people who were dying were the frail elderly who at that point, the average age of those in Canada who were dying was 83. So all of their panic was absurd.
Yes.
Klaus Schwab had, of course, said if no one is safe until everyone is vaccinated, but those who were dying were in the old age homes, and so I mean it was absurd, and so I then eventually went on a group of actually when they started going after the children, that is when I was invited to go on a speaking tour with Dr. Stephen Malthouse. And we went, so I think there were about 5 tours, and those ones were through mostly in BC, one into Alberta and into Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned the other ones that I did, with Mark Trozzi in Ontario. So there's a whole series of them. These really antagonized the college, because I wasn't just telling people about what I had seen firsthand as evidence in my own patients. I was also talking about the bigger picture of the myocarditis and all of the sudden deaths. And amongst my patients, I'd only had one sudden death after vaccination. But I mean, even one sudden death, vaccines are supposed to keep people safe. When you die suddenly after your shot, something's a little wrong there. Mm-hmm. So the college accused me of misinformation, of professional misconduct for spreading misinformation. And in fact, their response to my letter to Bonnie Henry was to send a warning to all doctors across the province, and I think it probably went across Canada. I'm not exactly sure about the other provinces, but every doctor in BC got a warning from the college that if you speak misinformation about COVID or the COVID vaccines, you will be put under investigation and, if necessary, disciplined.
Yes. The Ontario doctors got that too in April of 2021. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And it seemed like my letter, which went, I think it was dated 5th of April, 2021, seemed to be the trigger for that, because that letter went far and wide, because I was just giving firsthand evidence of what I was seeing as a family doctor. And so when I went on these speaking tours, that really antagonized them, and they issued this. They told me I was under investigation. Well, I knew I was already under investigation, but I'm not one to back down. I'm all about truth, and so they then started this relentless. I mean, the number. I think I was chatting with Stephen Malthouse and some of the others that have had complaints against them. I think I had 18 complaints from the college. That I had to reply to about specific things, that I'd said. I made a speech in Victoria on the 75th anniversary of the start of the Nuremberg trials for the doctors.
Right.
And that was, it was and I then spoke about informed consent and forcing people to have experimental treatments that they do not want and that are clearly harmful. And that speech outside of the legislature in Victoria, that got me more complaints than anyone else, because now I was confronting doctors. on this issue, and this made this made them very uncomfortable. Anyway, so I've done a few things that have rattled their cage, and so anyway, the outcome of this, as you mentioned, after 4 years, has been that they have now backed down and dropped all the charges against me.
Yes.
Now, so this is interesting, because I have a brilliant lawyer, an absolutely brilliant lawyer, whose name is Lee Turner, and he's also here in southern BC.
Yeah.
And he assembled 8 world-class expert witnesses to deal with each one of the areas of accusations that I was accused of misinformation. And I can tell you what those areas were. Let me get out a list here, because I'll probably get it wrong. So the first one was the large number of deaths, all the died suddenly people, the large number of deaths of people who died after their vaccine. And I think the score on that, if you look at the open VAERS, is 37,500 people are recorded in open VAERS as having died unexpectedly, with that is with a 28-day cutoff after their COVID charge. So these are people who there's no other explanation for their death. And so that's up to 37,500 in the US.
Yeah, and just to put that in perspective, I think the worst case of death counts on an experimental drug before that was 30 before they cut it off. Was it not?
It was. I think, that was one of the flu vaccines, I think.
Right.
And they pulled that from the market when 35 people died.
Right.
And I think they had vaccinated, it was a massive number of people as well. And of course, the excuse of the authorities, well, we've given a lot of shots, so, when you, I think they have given over 13 billion shots worldwide.
Wow.
So of course, some people have had 8 shots now, but, but their excuse is, well, if you look at the number of shots we've given, that's not too bad. I still think killing 37,500 people with something that's supposed to keep them safe is a bit ridiculous.
Yeah. We kind of agree with you over here.
Yeah. So anyway, public health in BC did not agree that this vaccine was associated with a large number of deaths. So that was misinformation. My letter to Bonnie Henry spoke about neurological harm, and they denied neurological harm. And it's interesting, the Canadian version of the VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. There's a Canadian one called CARES, which is the Canadian
adverse effects from immunization. AEFI, I think, is our Canadian government one, which holds no information. CARES is one that was set up to counteract the AEFI, because doctors were not allowed to imprint or report to the AEFI. Yes. They were being returned. Yes.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in the CARES, the top category of vaccine injuries was neurological. It was above clots and cardiac, and everything else was neurological. And of course, so they were denying that this caused neurological harm. I don't know what they think all the strokes and the and MS and Guillain-Barré and all the other things, that there's huge numbers of them. But anyway, then of course the microclotting, they denied that this thing caused microclotting. They contested the fact that I said it would affect female fertility because of the proof that so much of the spike proteins end up in the ovaries. And of course, if you damage the ovaries, you have permanent reduction in fertility. It is just a fact of science. I'd spoken about at a time when they were trying to create hatred against the unvaccinated.
Yes,
they were treating the unvaccinated as the absolute scum of the earth, just like Hitler treated the Jews. They were treating the unvaccinated. You remember, we were banned from restaurants and sports events, and people lost their jobs, and so because they said, even though at that point there was no evidence that the vaccine stopped infection or transmission, they said by being vaccinated, you can keep other people safe. So if you're not vaccinated, you are putting others at risk, which was, of course, absurd. So I pointed out the fact that actually it's the other way around. The vaccinated are putting people at risk.
Yes.
And it's in two ways. I mean, firstly, because vaccinated people get way more COVID than unvaccinated because their immune systems are ruined. But secondly, through shedding. Shedding is this is a self-spreading poison. And people were being harmed through shedding. And so that was one of the other issues that I was criticized for. And then, myocarditis and the risks to children, because, there was no benign explanation for their determination to vaccinate all the children. Yes. Children are naturally protected against COVID because they have hardly any ACE2 receptors in their respiratory mucosa, which means they get very little infection and they don't transmit it either. So their cancellation of university registrations and refusing kids to allowed to participate in sport and be involved in activities because they weren't vaxxed had no basis in science. These children were not putting anyone at risk and were not at risk themselves. And yet they were determined to have them all vaccinated, for which there was no benign explanation. And so that was really the motive for my speaking tours, was to try and protect the children because they are the future of Canada. Yes. So, and then, of course, the issue around ivermectin as an alternative, they were determined that no one should have an alternative to this vaccine and actively prevented people from getting anything like that. So my lawyer assembled these 8 world-class expert witnesses to deal with every pillar of accusation against me. And when the college saw this, their response was to apply for judicial notice. And so for your listeners who may not have heard of judicial notice, most people had never heard of it before this pandemic.
Right.
Because this is a powerful way of perverting justice.
Yes.
Yes.
And when a court grants judicial notice, effectively what they're saying is that they are declaring certain facts to be irrefutable and therefore you cannot contest them. And so the college was saying the fact that these vaccines are safe and effective is irrefutable. Therefore, you are not allowed to say anything to the contrary, which would then mean that I am not allowed to defend myself. And none of the 8 expert witnesses who my lawyer had recruited to testify on my behalf would be allowed to testify. And all of their expert testimonies would not be allowed to be admitted as court documents. In other words, this is a powerful way of burying the evidence. Yeah. And before this pandemic, this principle had very seldom ever been used. But in this pandemic, it was used widely. I think my lawyer looked up over 40 times in this pandemic, and usually in conflicts over where you'd have 2 parents, and one would want the kid to get the COVID shot, and the other wouldn't, and they'd go to court, and the court would grant judicial notice to the fact that the shots are safe and effective. And which basically railroads the process so that you can't present the evidence.
Right.
So when the college tried to get judicial notice on their so-called facts, of which the first was safe and effective, this was just a blatant effort at cover-up. I mean, it was just bury the evidence. And so this was the first battle, because the precedent had been set in Canada from all these other cases to just grant judicial notice to whatever public health said. And by the grace of God, this disciplinary panel, which is effectively a jury appointed by the college,
right?
And these are people who work for the college. They're picked by the college and they're paid by the college. So this is not an impartial jury,
right?
No,
this is people who are on their page dancing to their tune. So I wasn't expecting justice when you've got this kind of a jury. And so this was a very interesting trial, I think, of those five people in this disciplinary panel to see if they would be honest.
Yes.
Right.
And by the grace of God, they were. They said, no, there is. And so this application for judicial notice was used very cleverly by my lawyer to submit all of those expert testimonies as court documents to show that the safe and effective story is not irrefutable.
Yeah.
And so suddenly all of these brilliant scientific documents became court documents, and those members of the disciplinary panel had to look at them. So this was brilliant. I mean, this was fantastic. While they were trying to block this from getting to the disciplinary panel, my lawyer used that as a way to get it in.
Yes.
So he's brilliant. He is so clever. So they couldn't. They couldn't bury the evidence. So the next thing they did was schedule my trial at a time when they knew my lawyer was not available.
Oh.
And he had told them, so and he kept telling them, I'm not available at that time. I'm on another case in the Supreme Court. And they said, well, then Dr. Hoffe needs to get another lawyer. Wow. And this was just another tactic to pervert justice and to literally try and sink me, because they had given this warning to all doctors out there: if you contradict the narrative, you will be investigated and disciplined. And so I was their chosen scapegoat to beat all other doctors into submission. I was the poster boy for punishment for not towing the party line.
Right.
And so when the colleges, and the college had 7 lawyers working on this. I mean, they took my case very seriously. They have spent a fortune trying to take me down. And when they didn't get the judicial notice, and they accepted the application that telling me to get another lawyer was not fair, I'm allowed to choose my legal representative, my legal counsel. Right. And they then had to. Then the panel said, no, Dr. Hoffe is entitled to choose his lawyer. Then the college just dropped everything. Every tactic that they had used to try to bury me had failed.
So we're assuming then they came to the determination that they would lose in court, and they didn't want this evidence going into court and setting precedents elsewhere. Is that what we're assuming?
I think so. I think that is very much the case, because they had one expert witness who is a family doctor who specialized in epidemiology. And his name is Dr. Trevor Cornell, and he worked as Bonnie Henry's right-hand man through the first 2 years of the pandemic.
Wow.
So he was their expert witness on every area that I mentioned, everything from ivermectin to microclotting to neurological problems. So he was their man. And so when they saw that I had 8 people who were just way out of his league, these were the best of the best: Peter McCulloch and Pierre Corey and James Thorpe, who's a brilliant gynecologist from Texas, who's spoken about all the miscarriages and the fertility issues and all of these things. And so, these people were true experts. The college's so-called expert really wasn't an expert in any of these issues. Right. And so when they didn't get their judicial notice, their response was, well, then we also want 8 expert witnesses. We're going to go and find them. And so they set out, because, they realized that they were seriously outgunned on this.
Yes.
And so they then, they said, look, just give us time. We're going to find 8 people. We've also got to have 8 expert witnesses. They were taking this very seriously.
Right.
And so I think that they did find some of them. They never managed to find a gynecologist who would validate for the safety of these shots in pregnancy or what they did to fertility. They couldn't find anybody who would vouch for that. Wow. And so they eventually just dropped everything.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So do you think they're going to come at you sideways another way now, or do you think you're just free and clear finally, once and for all?
That's an interesting thing. When I see what they did to Stephen Malthouse is a family doctor here in BC who had written a letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry a few months before my letter, and his was simply talking about the fact that there was no science behind using masks. There was no science behind lockdowns. There's no science behind social distancing and all this stuff. It was ridiculous. And he was just pointing out the absurdity of the public health measures. But that was before there were any vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so he was also under investigation because he was not towing the party line. And he had also gone on speaking tours with me. In fact, he was the one that invited me to go on these speaking tours. And so they trapped him with he was doing mask exemptions for people.
Yes.
And I hope I get the story correct. You might have to talk to him about it. But he was doing telephone appointments for people who wanted mask exemptions. And so the college sent somebody who was a setup, basically,
Right.
to say that they wanted a mask exemption. And he said, well, why do you want a mask exemption? And so this person said, well, because I don't want to wear a mask. They're very unhealthy and they can't stop a virus, and they're dehumanizing, and I don't want to wear a mask. And so he said, well, I quite agree. And he gave this person a mask exemption. But this whole thing was recorded.
Yes.
And used as evidence against him that this was a fraudulent mask exemption. I mean, even though even though it was all true, even an N95 mask, which are the expensive medical ones, the holes in an N95 mask are approximately 20 microns.
Yeah.
And a COVID virus is approximately 1.5 microns in diameter.
Right.
The flu virus is even smaller. It's about 1.2 microns. So it's like trying to stop a mosquito with a chain link fence wearing one of these masks. It's ridiculous. And yet they took his medical license, and he still doesn't have it, over a fraudulent mask exemption. And so I had so many people asking me for vaccine exemptions.
Right.
And they were RCMP and all sorts of people, bus drivers and teachers and all sorts of people who were being forced to have these shots that they didn't want, didn't trust, and didn't need. And so I was wary that the college was determined to nail me on as many things as they could. And so I was very careful with all of and I'm still doing vaccine exemptions for people that are going to the US that are being forced to have them to get a green card, to scientifically justify everything that I say. So in case one of these is a setup and gets sent to them as fraudulent in some way.
Right.
And so there were some people who wanted a vaccine exemption, and I said, look, I'm afraid there isn't any reason that would stand up at my trial for you to, in other words, you don't have any personal specific risks with this.
Right.
Yeah. And so I've had to be very careful, knowing that, because you don't know who is a trap.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah. So I remember Dr. Malthouse, and I remember the mask exemptions, and I also remember at the time that they sold it on. It was in droplets. It got spread through droplets, and the droplets were bigger than the mask holes. But it was in January of 2021 that Tam came out publicly and said, well, it's actually an aerosol. And that got buried under the carpet. So she admitted right then and there that masks don't work. And then you're right. Most people don't know that Dr. Malthouse was the first one to speak out in BC. And then you came along shortly afterwards. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Let's clear this story up. My understanding is that when people wanted to get vaccinated, you ordered D-dimers for them before and after they got vaccinated. And thereby you had the proof that it was causing clots. Is that correct? Or am I?
Yeah, that is correct. When I saw all this harm, I reported it to the authorities because, I was submitting vaccine injury reports, and every single one of them was literally censored. You couldn't just register a vaccine injury. It went to a medical health officer who decided if she agreed that this was a vaccine injury. And if it didn't meet her criteria, nope, this is a coincidence. Do they need their next shot? And it didn't matter how ruined this person was from their shot. They were I submitted 14, and every single one was rejected by public health as a coincidence. So it was absurd. And in fact, Bonnie Henry's response to my letter was to refer me to a vaccine safety specialist called Dr. Monica Naus, who was the top vaccine safety person in BC. And so I had a telephone discussion with Dr. Monica Naus, who assured me that all of the new problems that had arisen in my patients after their COVID vaccines were all coincidences, and they couldn't be from the vaccine. I mean, without any investigation of any of my patients, they were all just written off out of hand. So I realized that this is ridiculous. This is not a vaccine safety specialist. This is a vaccine injury denier.
Yes.
This was absurd. If there's no other explanation for it, you have to assume it's the vaccine. It's like the died suddenly thing. If there's no other explanation for why they should die suddenly, you can't say, well, there's no way of proving it's the vaccine. There's no other option.
Right.
So I then, Dr. Byron Bridle had the Pfizer study, the Pfizer biodistribution study, which was done on mice in Japan, and it had only been published in Japanese. And Dr. Byron Bridle had it translated into English. And this showed that Pfizer knew that this vaccine went intravenous very shortly after injection, and that it went to every part of your body, of which, by the way, the ovaries were in the top 4, hence all the concerns about fertility.
Right.
So knowing that this went intravenous, and knowing therefore that all these spike proteins are going to be, the messenger RNA is going to get absorbed into the cells around your blood vessels. I mean, it's only logical if that's where the vaccine is. It's not in your arm, it's in your circulation. So it's going to get absorbed into the endothelium, which is the lining around blood vessels. And that's where you're going to get all the spike proteins made in these cells around blood vessels. So it was only logical. I mean, it was absolutely predictable that clotting would occur because that's where these spike proteins were, in the worst possible place. They were all so I started asking my patients if I could monitor their COVID. If they would, I said, I'm concerned these might be causing microclots, which you may not have any symptoms of. Would you like me to monitor your COVID shot, which will require you to have this D-dimer test before your shot and a second one a week later? Which was
Brilliant, by the way. We just want to hats off and applaud you for having the presence of mind to do that. And I also, my suspicion is that's probably why they came after you in a bigger way. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. And so quite a lot of the people who I spoke to about this, because I started speaking to every patient that came into my office in my family practice. And so unfortunately, a lot of them had already had their COVID shot. But if they had it within the previous 8 days, I thought, well, can we still just check your D-dimer? Because we know there's a normal level. And so some, I think it was about a third I had both, but maybe 2/3 I only had an post-shot D-dimer. And when I had got the first 8 results back, and 5 out of the 8 had a positive D-dimer, I was absolutely horrified.
Yeah.
Because I thought maybe it would be like 1 in 20 or I don't know, like maybe 5%. Right. But when it literally worked out from those first 8 people, it was 63% had evidence of microclotting. Wow. And the impact of this was that these people were not vaccine injured. They had no idea what these shots were doing to them. This was like a stealth weapon that was causing clots in their body that they had no idea about. And you know, the relevance, well, you think, well, what's the big issue with the clot? These are if they've got no symptoms, why is this an issue? Well, the issue is that a clotted vessel never goes back to normal. It is permanently damaged. It never heals. It might heal a little. If it's a capillary, it's done for. If it's a big vessel, it can open up partially. But if you've ever known somebody that's had a DVT in a leg, that leg usually stays swollen for the rest of their lives. It never completely goes back to normal. And so the issue was that more than half of people were getting the clots. The damage is permanent, and obviously it was going to accumulate with every shot.
Right.
And they were told at that point you need at least 2, and of course they didn't know that the boosters go on forever. So this was, I was absolutely horrified. And so I had an interview coming up with, I think it was with Laura Lynn, Tyler Thompson on her TV program, and she, the people were eager because no other doctors would say anything.
Right.
They kept asking me, so what do you tell us? What are you seeing? What's happening in your practice? What? And I was willing to talk about it. And I told her about what I was finding with this and how horrified I was. And that interview literally went viral instantly around the world.
Right.
Because the proof was there. And then, of course, it was just over a week after that the whole town, there was this firestorm in Lytton, and my practice burned to the ground, and the lab where the D-dimer tests were being done was annihilated. I mean, everything was annihilated. I think 3 houses survived in the town, and everything. The ambulance even burned right in its bay. There were 2 fire engines in town. They lost one of them in the fire. They managed to save 1 fire. It was a terrifying day.
Well, that was unfortunate timing, hey?
Oh yeah. So that was
Another
the end of my,
coincidence.
that was the end of my D-dimer research. Yeah, that's where it ended. And so when the dust, so there were obviously patients who had, so there were a few more results that hadn't come in. And when the rest of the results came in, I had 15 people who had done D-dimers, and it was 8 out of 15 had positive D-dimers, which works out as 52%, I think, or 53%, I think. So it was still more than half. More than half of people clotted. And this was their first shot. And obviously, as I mentioned, it accumulates. So this was my simple way of trying to find out how I could help my patients, because the authorities clearly were not interested in even admitting what they were doing. They for all of these restrictions that were put upon us were all about keeping us safe. Do you remember that? Everything, just out of an abundance of caution, we're going to do X, Y, Z. It was all about safety. And yet their absolute refusal to listen to look at the safety signals, or and their determination to punish whistleblowers showed that nothing that they were doing was about safety. This was medical tyranny on steroids.
Right. And most people would have backed off. You doubled down. I remember that fire at Lytton. I mean, the whole town was just devastated. There were rivers of molten metal everywhere. It was, and I think twice it burned down. Did you not have another fire after that? Or?
No, there was another fire in a different place the following year on the other side of the Fraser River.
Okay.
But it wasn't. No,
Sorry.
No, I wasn't there. No, I wasn't there.
You have a second practice over there. Yes.
No, so I now, so fortunately they were not able. They didn't like my so-called misinformation, but they weren't able to fault my practice of medicine.
Right.
They weren't able to find some it's by the grace of God they didn't take my medical. I mean, they could have, just for my misinformation, I suppose, tell me that I'm misinforming my patients or something. But they didn't, and so I've been so grateful to still be able to earn a living, even though I was fired from the ER for telling an ER nurse that a patient with proven natural immunity to COVID didn't need a vaccination. And of course, everyone that got a mild infection with COVID had natural immunity.
Yes.
That's why it was mild. Mm-hmm. When you catch a cold or the flu and you're better in 48 hours, you had natural immunity to that. And that's what protected you. That's why you weren't sick for 10 days. Right. And so anybody that got COVID mildly had proven natural immunity.
Yes.
And so forcing those people to be vaccinated was cruel and unscientific and absurd, because the shots ruined their natural immunity, which is why those people ended up, they're still getting COVID over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been proven several times over now that the shots are dangerous, and they knew that they were dangerous ahead of time. It's been proven, I don't know how many ways.
Well, it was in the Pfizer contract, Section 5.5 said right there, there's no proof that these are going to work.
And that they're safe. So right in the contract, it says the customer, the signing agent, in this case, Anita and acknowledges that we cannot guarantee either safety or efficacy. So they knew right at the contract.
Yeah, and that it was still under investigation. Yes. So they knew and they signed it, and then they pushed it on the Canadian people anyway, with falsehoods and false claims.
And then buried the evidence after the study started coming out in April, I believe they started coming out, and they buried that evidence. So, Well,
they buried the Pfizer evidence as well. And they had the Pfizer evidence in October, which is the same month that Anita and signed the Canadian document.
Yeah. So do you think this is it now? They're not going to try and take your license? Now, they signed, was it Bill 63, which actually makes it even, you could go to jail now instead of just losing your license.
Yeah. So that it was Bill 36. It was Bill 36 here in BC that is now called the HPOA. It's the Health Practitioners It was Health Practitioners and Occupations Act, HPOA. And so this is a 400-page document that is like legislated medical tyranny. So under this bill, which was an act of parliament, was brought in by the BC government, if a doctor is guilty of misinformation, it's a $200,000 fine plus 6 months in jail. Okay. If you and you're not allowed to appeal it. You're not allowed to appeal it. So, I mean, this is tyranny on steroids. But if you've got a medical corporation, and I do, I'm Dr. Charles Hoffe, Inc. So if you're incorporated, which many doctors just did for tax reasons, because you have a slightly lower tax bracket if you keep some money in your corporation. Yes. If you have a medical corporation, it's a $500,000 fine plus the 6 months in jail for misinformation. So, and you can't appeal it. So you wonder why any doctors are left in BC. I mean, if they knew about this, they wouldn't be in BC. And in fact, I'm probably just a kamikaze, I think, because this is unbelievable. Especially, how do you define misinformation?
Yes.
Science is always a work in progress. That's the nature of science. Science requires different viewpoints, requires testing, questioning the things that we think are true to see if they really are true. Science requires that debate and different viewpoints. So this idea of misinformation, which is simply defined as disagreeing with the government, and then to have these kind of punishments like the sword of Damocles dangling over your head it seems like a way of destroying healthcare, because who would ever want to practice medicine under that?
Right.
Well, and I thought the whole point of medicine is the ability to get second, third, fourth opinions. And I'm assuming if you're getting different opinions, they're probably going to be different. So who's the one giving misinformation if all these opinions are different based on their own experiences, their own evidence or facts that they have seen, read, or had in their own offices? Who's the misinformation then? What's the point of getting second opinions?
Yeah, well, exactly. No, so I mean, this label of misinformation is arbitrary. We really saw it in this pandemic where they had these fact checkers, who were just journalists who appointed themselves as experts and, were fact checking Peter McCulloch and all these other world experts to discredit them. And so, I mean, I had fact checkers. I mean, there were all kinds of when I did the D dimer stuff. There were a whole bunch of fact checkers that went after that, showing that it was all invalid. And the fact checkers were the ones that decided if it was misinformation. And but to have those kind of fines where you end up in jail with a criminal record and financially impoverished for disagreeing with the government is hard to believe that is legislation in Canada.
Well, that's exactly what when 36 came out, I said, this bill has no business in a supposed free country. And the fact that they would even put it forward means that their arrogance has gotten the better of them and they don't believe that there's accountability coming their way. And now look what's happening. I mean, this is probably the most tyrannical government in Canada, the BC government now, the EB, Bonnie Henry, and Adrian Dick's evil dichotomy. And then now look, people are calling
Shaw's there too now.
I don't think she ended up going to BC, but there are people in the States saying, I think we could extradite EB for being a drug dealer at this point, because all this illegal fentanyl is hitting the streets and going across the border, right? So look at that in comparison. They're coming after you. Meanwhile, they're the biggest drug dealers in Canada at this point.
Yeah, but the other aspect to Bill 36 or this HPOA, which is seriously wrong, is this bill gives every college, and there are 6 different colleges. There's a college of nurses and different chiropractors and whatever other things. It gives the colleges the authority to mandate any vaccine at any time as a licensing requirement.
Yes.
So the effect of, effectively mandating a vaccine basically means that that person has to therefore relinquish autonomy over their own body. The college will decide what you will be injected with next.
Yes.
And if you don't want the injection, you're disqualified and you can no longer work. And so this is one of the pillars of medicine, is that nobody should ever be forced in any way through any form of coercion to have any medical treatment or medical test that they don't want. And yet this is now in the law in BC that doctors can be forced to have this. And so this is absurd, because this in itself it's contrary to the code of ethics of the Canadian Medical Association, which entrenches the importance of informed consent.
Yes.
That you can never, it is never valid to force anyone to have a medical treatment or medical test that they don't want.
No, and didn't they amalgamate, like the review board now oversees all of the different colleges, and it's like 10 people or something, and they're the review board that decides now on cases and whatnot.
Yes, well, they reduced the number of colleges, so the College of Physicians and Surgeons is still the one that oversees doctors, but a lot of the other colleges that were much smaller, they're like physiotherapists or chiropractors or naturopaths or other things, they amalgamated them. So I think this was just a way of, this is just more bureaucracy and tighter control. Yes. They didn't want much variability between this. It's all about, this is just medical tyranny. This is about control.
So until somebody actually fights this all the way up to the Supreme Court, this legislation is going to stand. So it's going to take someone like yourself to push the boundaries all the way to the top to get this bill deemed unconscionable, illegal, what have you. Mm-hmm. So again, the process is the punishment.
It is. And that's what I've seen very much in my case, where they, the college warned doctors that if you speak misinformation, you'll be investigated and punishment. And so then they launched. So I was their poster boy to basically show that they were serious. And that's why they took my case. I mean, to put 7 lawyers on my case is, the lawyers usually, the cheap ones are $500 an hour.
Yeah.
Lawyers are very expensive.
Yes.
And so to have 7 lawyers working to take me down, I mean, it wasn't 7 all the time, but it, it was incredible. I mean, and they kept increasing their efforts. So it was amazing that they eventually backed off because they were not showing any signs of backing down. They were determined to punish me and to make an example of me. So this is by the grace of God.
So is there a possibility they dropped all the charges, but they could now come back under this HPOA and come after you that way? Is that possible? Yes. Okay.
Yes, they could. No, because they can go after other things that I've said.
Right.
That citation just listed about, I think it was 8 different things that were points of conflict that they said were misinformation, and so. Yeah, I mean, if they want to sink me, they can find other things that they don't agree with. The fact that, I mean, I've spoken about many other things, like the gender reassignment and all of this stuff and what that does to people psychologically and how it increases the suicide rate, and all of that. I mean, I have spoken publicly about these things because there is so much evidence of harm in that, if they're looking for things to sink me on, that have, according to them are so-called misinformation, but I follow the evidence, and I think that was their difficulty with me, was that I was a first-hand witness. I'd been family doctor to the people who are vaccine injured in my practice. At that time, I'd been their family doctor for 28 years. And I knew them very well. Yes. And I knew all of their health conditions and that there was no other explanation for what was happening to them. And so the fact that I was literally advocating for them and I was being their advocate to try and protect them against this absurd abuse of them, that was hard for the college to deal with, because when somebody is a first-hand witness, how do you, unless you can somehow show that they're lying, and they couldn't. They couldn't.
So do you have any plans to leave BC, or are you going to stick it to the bitter end?
When we had a provincial election last, October, and this NDP government got very narrowly reelected, and there's all sorts of accusations that this was not quite honest, that the electoral process. Exactly. But their majority and their position in the government is very narrow, and I had said that I was going to have to leave BC because I was going to be the first one in jail under the HPOA,
right?
Because anyway, so I'm still here. This is where my practice is. I keep praying that somehow things will change. Action for Canada has launched a legal action against it. The whole bill is completely unconstitutional, and so, I mean, it's just absurd that it was ever rubber stamped. but
Yeah.
they only debated half of it. It's a massive document. They only debated half of it and then just said, okay, look, we've talked about this enough. We're going to vote. And so
that.
they never even looked at the parts that are the medical tyranny, because
Yes.
they're hidden amongst the fine print. They're hidden amongst literally hundreds of pages of fine print.
Right.
Right.
Wow. Yeah. So what keeps you going, Dr. Hoffe? What keeps you moving forward?
My faith in God, that's why I did what I did.
Yeah.
It's like, I often compare it to the parable of the Good Samaritan. When you see someone else who is being harmed or who is in great danger, if you do nothing to keep them safe or to protect them, you are guilty of their harm. If you just look the other way in order to protect yourself, you are complicit in their harm. So that is why when I saw what was happening to my patients and the people of Canada, it was my duty as a Christian and as a doctor to speak up. And so, if you love God, you will love your neighbor. The one follows from the other.
Yes.
And so it is my faith in Jesus Christ, my love of God and my love of my neighbor that made me willing to risk all to do the right thing. And over it, I've lost my wife, I've lost my children. My children have not spoken to me in almost 4 years. I have lost that which I loved most.
Mm-hmm.
But I have done.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No. So this has been a very, my battle against the medical authorities has been minor compared to what I've endured from my wife, who is determined to take me down and leave me penniless. And so that goes on. That's not, anyway, that's a whole different issue. But this has been a tough 4 years. And these two things started side by side. The one, but my persecution by the authorities really was the last straw that my wife wouldn't tolerate. She decided she was going to distance herself from me in every way she could.
Right.
It was tough.
The personal losses, I think, are the absolute worst thing that these tyrants above us have inflicted on us. It's one thing about your medical autonomy, but it's another when they're turning children against parents, people who have loved each other for many years and trusted each other and leaned on each other through thick and thin, all of a sudden can't even look at each other because the government has so implanted the safe and effective, and if you're not protecting me, then you must not love me, without even looking at the evidence, without even having the discussion of the evidence, and just taking the word of government strangers who have different agendas. And the agenda is not to take care of family. The agenda is not to keep God in our lives. It really, truly is to destroy as much love, as much family, as much community as they possibly can. And the division is real and the heartache is real. And that is the worst part of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Intentionally induced trauma, and that it takes its toll on people, and it's mind-boggling to me because it's the deception of it too, because they can't see you for who you are right now. And I know this makes you extremely uncomfortable and embarrasses you when I say stuff like this, and I get it, and I apologize for that. But I have heard national hero, a national treasure. I have heard hero doctor. I've heard all of these things. You are one of the most highly respected people in this country, and it's amazing that the people closest to you can't see that right now, and it's rough. It's rough.
Yeah.
So
it's very rough, but this is a satanic thing. I mean, to destroy families, as you say, to set children against their parents. This darkness is literally satanic, that so many people have been blinded. I mean, the fact that so many people just followed all these lies and hated those that they previously loved who didn't want the shots. I mean, it was really, there was no other explanation for this completely illogical hatred, because they knew the shots didn't stop you getting COVID, but yet somehow they thought that these other people were putting them at risk. It was completely illogical. It was like a veil over them, that they'd lost all rational thinking and could literally refuse to have people in their homes, and refuse to people who they loved. And this is an evil time. I mean, but it is tragic how this has played out in so many families. And the sad thing is those people who did these things, that treated their unvaccinated relatives with such hatred and such prejudice, do not want to apologize. I haven't heard of a single case where they went to the person and said, I realize that I was seriously out of line. Please, will you forgive me? I've never heard of that. Yeah. And why can people, they just sort of somehow think that the passage of time just takes away sin. And, from a Christian perspective, that's absurd, because if the passage of time takes away sin, Christ died needlessly.
Right.
Correct.
We need to deal with our past sins and repent of them and make things right, because you can't just pretend nothing happened.
Right.
We've got a lot of healing that needs to happen in this nation.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So, wow, I forgot to put up everything. You've got to Give Send Go right there. Just go to givesendgo.com and look up Dr. Hoffe if you want to support your ongoing legal issues, and you're off touring a lot as well. And then you told us about this at the last minute. Canary in a post-COVID world. This is an amalgamation of chapters written by several people, and you've got a chapter in this one book, which we are excited to find out about.
Yeah.
So I was invited to contribute to this book. So this is volume 2. The first. So this is a compilation of essays or chapters by people who were canaries in this pandemic. People. So I was told I was a canary. The canary in the coal mine was that little bird that tells you that there is something seriously wrong, that warns you about a great danger.
Yeah, and but of course, by dying, let's just be clear about that. So, I don't know if that's a good thing or not.
And so I was asked to write a chapter for this book, and it really tells my story of what I've been through, but also a whole bunch, and I'm one of 37, and they are brilliant authors. There's people like Peter McCulloch and Robert F. Kennedy, and in fact, between the 2 volumes of these books, 4 of my expert witnesses have all contributed. So wow. These are brilliant scientists and brilliant people who have made a huge difference to this world through this crazy last 5 years that we've gone through since the beginning of COVID. And so anyway, that's just a place where people, if they want to read the account and all the details, it's in there. I think I'm chapter 6 or something like that in the book.
Awesome.
It's amazing. And your chapter, Integrity Under Fire, you were approached by another gentleman who's writing a book and wanted to include your chapter as his opening, which it says something about what you wrote. It clearly speaks to people. So
yes, so this is a psychologist in Oregon who approached me. He said he read my chapter and was almost reduced to tears.
Wow.
Because he just said he just found it such a gripping story, And he asked me if he could use it as he's writing a book on mind control. And he thought that my firsthand account of what happened to me in this pandemic as I tried to keep others safe was just a brilliant boots on the ground, firsthand account of the evil of this pandemic and what it did to people. And he asked me if he could publish that as the introduction to his book on mind control. And so anyway, that book's not out yet, and I don't know what it's going to be called. But yeah, so I think my testimony of what has happened speaks volumes about many things that are wrong with our world. And there's much that we can learn from it.
And the first through the gates always get the bloodiest. But I tell you what, but someone has to be first, and you were first with integrity and factual evidence, and they had to drop the charges. So
yes,
there's something to be said about that.
The canary who lived. Yes.
The canary who lived. God had it.
Thank you. That's a very, because of course the canary would die in those coal mines, and that's how
right.
They know that there was methane gas. But I'm still alive. I'm still very much alive.
That's good. That's good. We're happy to hear it. Now, we could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. And, over the years, we've gotten to know you, and we haven't connected. It's amazing. We haven't connected for over a year.
Over a year, yeah.
Yeah. So it's been really exciting for us to get to talk to you again. And we sure miss talking to you. But you're off, no rest for the non-wicked, I guess. You're off to speak at another event today in a neighboring town. So we can't keep.
Well, yeah, no, it's part of remembering the Freedom Convoy and how important it was. It's just in the neighboring town. They're doing a little convoy through the town just to honor those truckers who stood for our freedoms. And so I was asked if I'd go and join that. And so I'm going to go and join that, because the town that I live in is all burnt out. You can't buy anything. Actually, I just bought 4 liters of milk. That you can buy some junk food at the gas station. It's the only place where you can buy anything. It cost me $15.55 for a gallon of milk.
Oh.
So that's the town I live in. It's everything else is burnt. There's no stores or anything. So
right.
So yeah. So anyway, so the fact I can go to a neighboring town means I can buy food, which is quite an attraction.
Wow.
Well, having grocerying then at the same time.
Hit up the Give, Send, Go, everybody. Hokey
right.
doodles.
Yeah, we'll run that one more time for you. Go buy the book, and then there's donations that you can make over on drhoff.ca as well. There's the Give, Send, Go. There's drhoff.ca. If you want to support this, I'll say it, you won't, this national hero doctor, and a lovely person. You're one of my favorite people on the planet. So thank you for spending time with us again.
And God is not with you yet, so don't put away those boxing gloves.
That's right.
This is quite a ride. Well, I sort of wait to see what he's got for me next around the next corner. It's never boring.
No, that's true. You can cancel Netflix at least. Save some money there, because it's you don't need cable anymore.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Looking forward to talking to you at some point in time and finding out, just getting updates here and there on how your life is going. And, God protects us when we do his work. And I believe he's got a big shield of protection over you, because you are listening and you are doing his work, and you're showing others how to do it with integrity. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yes. Well, good night, everybody. We will see you on Thursday. Good luck with your convoy. Hope it all goes well. And thanks again. Good night, everyone.